One, and we should be live. Hello, everyone. I am here with Jonny Curran. Hello, Jonny. Um, we are doing the final episode of the Aldershot coverage, this time with the TO himself. So, Jonny, you ran the event, and I hope you have a lot of insights to share with us about what happened there. And I will give like my feedback on how the results went compared to what was suggested, and maybe like give a few comments on that. We have a whole list of different things that we want to cover about the Aldershot event, and I also think we should maybe look to your future, what will happen next time. So, Jonny, what do you want to start out by saying here?
Yeah, so I'll start out, obviously, as you said, I TO'd the Operation Aldershot event with Andy, who basically was the founder of Pegasus Warlords over in Aldershot. He started out as a monthly games day,
Mm.
and Operation Aldershot basically started as a big thank you for all the guys for turning up. So really, it started as a local tournament, but we let anyone come down until we hit capacity to fill those slots and basically give the local guys a bit of variety to play against as well. And so yeah, so one of the big bits of feedback I got from the players and also from Andy himself was just a huge thanks to yourself for the pre-match analysis, as I might call it, of all the lists. I know that the players really enjoyed seeing you tear apart their lists. um,
Again, I'm terribly sorry to the guys that I didn't like their lists. There are some lists I just don't like. I mean, what can you do? And
yeah,
there are, of course, lists that I will say, well, this is going to win, and yeah, let's see how my predictions turned out. But yeah,
yeah. Well, they
that
still enjoyed it, even so. I
okay.
think some of them had actually sent you lists before the event and then totally disregarded any advice you'd given. I think by the looks of things. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, they really thought that added a lot of excitement to the build up to the tournament. So that again, just huge thanks for that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, it's funny because I actually started doing videos because of tournaments that I ran myself, exactly for this reason, because it builds up excitement and focus. So I was happy to help. So you got what was it, 16 players in the end?
Yeah, exactly 16 players. It was basically the capacity of the room. So it was hosted in the game shop Aldershot is the name of the
Yeah.
shop in Aldershot, obviously. And they've got a number of gaming rooms. The
Mm.
biggest one they've got really has a capacity of about eight, six before tables, before it starts to get quite cramped. And
Yeah.
so we basically used that one room, and then that meant we could also keep an eye on everything without having to, because it's actually across multiple floors. And so if you expand past that, you
Mm.
end up having to TO across floors.
Oh, that that is difficult. Um, I have had run one tournament as a TO where I had to run between rooms, but it was at least on the same floor. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
So
that was why we sort of limited ourselves to 16
yeah.
players. And what I did as part of it is Andy, who TO'd with me on the day, so we possibly could have done it, but the reason we were hesitant was because we've kept him as the ringer. And so
Yeah.
actually, during all of the sort of pre-tournament setup, I kept him completely in the dark as much as
Yeah.
possible about everything. So he only saw the lists when they went live on your channel, basically, um, which was really nice because it meant that he also, if he was playing,
Yeah.
then he could play sort of unbiased.
Yeah.
So that was really good. Yeah.
And
And
Andy was the guy who had submitted a list that was the SS Cavalry, right? Yeah.
no,
Because
he was running. Let me quickly just look how he was running it because he was doing something interesting with his list. Um, because he's convinced that early war Germans is where he wants to go. So, but what
yes.
what he did was so that I think it was just so he could take an extra
Mm.
rifle section. He was running with one of the I haven't got it up there. Sorry, it was Defense of the East platoon.
Ah.
But
Yeah.
what he did was he limited himself to early war equipment.
Okay.
As I say, I think the only reason he did that was just so he could have one extra squad of guys. Um, so that was his one. And then we had another list that came in because we'd had a dropout when we'd sent it to you, and
Yeah.
so there was
Okay.
another list of yeah.
Okay, cool. So how do you feel at the end of this day? How do you feel the day went? The atmosphere of it? How like people behaved, and did you do best sportsman as well?
We did, yeah. That was really the big thing for us because we knew it wasn't a GT, it wasn't WTC.
No.
It was all about just sort of like rewarding the community, giving them a chance, the newer players, to
Yeah,
try a tournament.
yeah,
And so you really want it to be good spirited and a positive atmosphere. And it really was, to be honest.
yeah,
I was a bit worried after the first game because what we did was on the scoring, instead of voting for your favorite opponent, we
yeah.
did a rank out of 10 for sportsmen.
Okay.
And so after every game, you said from 0 to 10, how would you rate your opponent? I never want to see this person again. To sort of, I would happily play this person every game from now on.
Yeah.
And after the first game, we had about 4 or 5 players on a 10, and so it was a bit of a panic
That
because I,
will happen every
yeah,
time. That's my experience. There's always
yeah,
like really difficult to get like yeah.
yeah. And so there was a bit of a panic after that. And
Oh,
so, because we were averaging about 9.5 on the sportsman score after the first game. And then, as I suppose you'd expect, as the day went on, people got more tired, a little bit more competitive. It dropped a little bit. I think we ended on 8.75
okay.
on the sportsmanship average. But what it meant was the player who won Best Sportsman got a perfect score, 10 for
Yeah.
every game. Um, but yeah, I think that was indicative of the
Okay.
entire atmosphere. It was really positive.
That is really positive. Yeah. And did you keep to your schedule as well? Because that can sometimes be problematic. It's surprising how much time is taken up by what happens in between games and the scoring and everything. Did that work out?
Yeah, that did generally. I think we had a 5 minute delay before the last game because,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, so, and that was part of the format, I suppose. So what I did was because I've played in a lot of tournaments where last dice is called,
Yeah.
and if you're at the top of a turn and someone's just pulled something, it doesn't feel great if someone suddenly snatches it on the last dice. So
Yeah.
what we did was we played 2 hour 15 rounds, called time at 2 hours, but instead of
Mhm.
calling last dice, we called last turn. So you basically
Okay.
played out the turn.
So
Um,
people actually had the time to finish that turn. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But then what happened was, I think the reason we had a slight delay on the third game was because someone had just started a turn, I think, with about 15,
Ooh.
16 dice. And so
Ooh.
we did say to them
Ooh.
when I saw it, I said,
Please play quickly.
yeah, I said to us, I said the hard limit is
Yeah.
2:15, so I am going to call absolute time then,
Yeah.
and we'll do a last dice.
Yeah.
And so what that meant was just the last result came in a little bit later, and the round turnover was a little bit slower.
I really like that idea of actually giving people the time to finish their turn, because it quite often is a very hard limit, especially in competitive tournaments. Although you do get used to it, but it is nice that you get to finish whatever it was, so that people don't feel cheated too much. Yeah.
Yeah, especially when you have the clock watchers who,
Yeah.
and then there's accusations of shenanigans like you're
Yeah.
watching the
Yeah.
clock, you took 20 seconds to pull
Yeah.
that dice. You don't
Yeah.
get any of that if you say you've got
No.
one more turn, have at it.
No, you
Yeah.
you get rid of a lot of the accusations of slow play in that regard, in that way. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So when I first read your restrictions for this tournament, I was surprised that those were the ones you picked. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, well,
How did this tournament get set up, and why these restrictions?
yeah, so as part of the sort of the origin story I spoke about earlier, it is very much sort of for the local guys who some of them are quite new, and so it was
Mm,
always going to be a softer event.
yeah,
And also because it's a smaller one, it allowed us to try some things, which was quite nice. And so we knew it was going to be a softer one. I have always enjoyed messing around with things to see,
yeah,
oh, if you just push this a little bit this way, what happens?
yeah.
And
Push
so,
push 50 points extra. I noticed
yeah,
that one.
exactly.
That was
Um,
brilliant. Yeah,
Well, yeah, so the 50 points extra was primarily to give people just a little bit extra to play with because I thought 50 points is exactly one machine gun.
yeah,
Perhaps, maybe someone will be foolish enough to take one, which would
yeah.
be nice to see. And also, because I am very competitive, I've got a list that's very optimized, no
Yeah.
fat. no wastage. And so giving people 50 points extra means for a lot of players who are very competitive, they don't really know what to do with it necessarily, because there are no 10, 50 tournaments.
Yeah. So they revisit their lists and sort of check everything twice. I know that I did exactly that, because I made a 1,050 point list just because you sent me that, and I was like, okay, what would I do? And you revisit all your choices, and you change some of them because of those extra points, and I think that's really healthy. I think it's a really good thing for the meta as well. I also think maybe especially the fact that you disallowed flamethrowers actually opened up for a lot of other stuff that you wouldn't normally see. I don't know that it's those lists that won, but it at least gave the chance of something quite different, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things I think I would have thrown in is I've been playing with the M6, the Dodge with the light anti-tank gun on the back, and that's 65 points, so 5 more than a bazooka. And that one, if I'm not allowed flamethrowers and I've got to deal with tanks, that's not a bad spend of those extra 50 points, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But in terms of the rest of the restrictions, it was your standard sort of no naval observers, no flamethrowers. Well, actually, the no flamethrowers was sort of just an extension of normally tournaments like this are doing sort of 1 or 2. But the reason I just got rid of them entirely was, again, to make people think, because when you allow 1 flamethrower, what happens is people open Easy Army, and first of all, they add a flamethrower team, then they add a Kubel wagon, and then they build a list. And so I just found that a bit boring. And again, the same thing happens with multi-launchers. The first thing you do is you put those 3 things in, and you're good to go. And then the other things. So one of the things that I'd been thinking about was, if a lieutenant, the problem with the lieutenant is if you add the second man, you lose the small team. And so for most people, that's not a worthwhile trade. But I thought, I wonder
if it is worth it if you push it to a 4-man unit. It's really worth it.
That's exactly what I thought.
You get those free SMGs, and it becomes a very usable small infantry unit. I completely agree. That is a fix for that spending as few points on your lieutenant sickness that we all have.
Yeah, and again, for the Germans who can't take that inexperienced, I thought taking a little 4-man team with 4 assault rifles, you have to take them at regular,
definitely.
But what a bargain that is.
Yes, it is.
But unfortunately, I was a bit sad we didn't really see much of that. There was one player who did do that, but other than that, no one. I don't think anyone really considered it as a big option.
No, I would have spent some of my points on that, I think.
Yeah.
Well,
I think this is where a lot of the restrictions come from, the things that I would like to spend points on. I thought, why not? I'll see if anyone else wants to. And on that note, actually, there was a special rule that said that if you buy a truck, you could put an MMG on it, even if it's not normally around, because people like Hungarians, they don't have access to that for some reason, even though they keep borrowing German trucks. So that was those ones. And then we just added a couple special rules, like smoke scatters instead of being placed by your opponent, because that rule's never made sense to me.
No.
And then the one rule that you never see, I thought, I wonder if people play it, if that one's a little bit more interesting, which was turret jam. So we added that one. Instead of getting jammed in the direction you're shot at from, the turret gets jammed in the direction it's pointing.
Where it's stuck. Yeah.
So instead of doing sort of a cartoon spin around, it gets stuck. And again, I thought that might encourage people to play those Stugs and things like that, where you've got those sort of turretless vehicles that are usually heavily disadvantaged because they're not much cheaper than the turreted version. But if turret jam's in play, maybe we'd see it. Yeah.
Nah, not that many Stugs I noticed.
I don't think there was one.
Yeah, well, right. Let's move on to the shout-outs. Do you have anybody you want to do shout-outs for with the help for this tournament? Then now is the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we had quite a lot of prize support, and that was one of the things on the feedback, was that the prize support was really good for a tournament of its size. So huge appreciation to everyone who helped. We had one of the players who came along, Simon, runs a commission painting business, tabletop painting, And his cavalry got a
By the
lot
way,
of love.
I will make a link in the description to that if people want to go and check him out. So, yeah,
Fantastic. I uploaded a picture of his cavalry and they got a lot of love. And so yeah, he donated quite a lot of kits and that was brilliant. First Corps, who do a lot of sort of metal models, and they sent over a lot of Brits, I think it was, and a squad of Fallschirmjäger, which was really nice. Any scale models sent over some, rather than sending one thing, they sent us 16 sort of objective markers, so crates and like
yeah,
jerry cans. And then Richard Humble, who is quite a big name over here
mm,
in the sort of bottle action community, and Field Armories, I believe, his company's name. He does a lot of 3D print things. He sent it over
yeah,
a 3D printed 8 rad, I think it was, and then actually hand in hand thank yous we had, because we wanted the tables to look good.
yeah,
What we did was, the club, usually we have sort of 4 or 5 tables set up. We actually opened it up to players to ask if anyone wanted to bring a table to help support. And
yeah,
so to say thank you for that, there's a company, 3D Printing Valley, which is quite local to us, and he printed some houses to give us rewards. Really good quality as well.
brilliant,
They
brilliant.
were filament printed, but I've got a filament printer, but these were, I don't know how he must have really finely tuned the printer, because I couldn't see the lines on them compared to my
Yeah.
prints. But
That's
yeah, so
pretty
we
good.
we
Yeah.
gave them, the people who brought the tables, we gave them a house each in
Yeah.
hopes that next year they'll bring it back.
It's kind of funny that you say that. In Denmark, it's pretty standard. Everyone brings tables for tournaments. It's just how it is. And even like big tournaments like the Danish Nationals, where we had like almost 40 players last time. Um, all of the tables were brought by the players. There were no like big club tables. But that is not normal in the UK or what?
Not so much, to be honest. I think I'm probably a bit spoilt. I've
Okay.
played quite a lot of tournaments I've been doing over in Southend.
Yeah.
They've got a really great club with loads of
Yeah.
scenery, so they never really need to borrow any. Um, and then a lot of the tournaments, I think the clubs are often willing to help out and
Yeah.
sort of throw in quite a lot.
Yeah.
So I think I've been quite spoilt historically that I've not had to bring bring your own table. I think the other thing with that, and one of the things that I did on the day was I tried to avoid people playing on their own tables,
Yeah.
because I know, especially
Yeah.
if you've got sort of a big print, something you've 3D printed, say for a house, for example, you
Yeah.
might know exactly how long that is, and that
Yeah.
might give you an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we are going to talk about the tables next. So if that was the shout outs,
Yeah,
then
perfect
I am
segue.
going to steal the screen here for a bit because I chose to download some of the pictures of the tables. Let's go here. Let's just see if I can blow it up big size. So, right. So this, can you see my picture here?
I
Good.
can indeed.
Right. So this one was one of the first ones, and I wanted to comment on this one, because oh my God, it's so difficult to make a good airport terrain table where it looks good and it's playable as well. And this one is just borderline for me. There is a lot of terrain outside of the airstrip itself, but the airstrip does become very open. I don't know if the players commented on that, but that is something that I quite often see. We have in my club as well. We do have an airstrip table, and it's really difficult to lay out well.
Absolutely
So
agree. That one was that's not one of the players brought, and it's not
no,
one we've really set up before at the club. That
yeah,
was one we were trying out on the day, and
yeah,
exactly as you say, there was a bit of a killing field in the middle, a bit of a no man's
yeah,
land.
yeah,
The only two things that and players did comment on it. The only two things that benefited it were
mm,
the bottom right hand corner of your photograph there. The
yeah,
runway, I think, is only about 12 inches on. And
yeah,
so actually that hedge has been pushed away. But if that hedge is up against the runway, if you're
yeah,
on that side, you
yeah,
can cross the runway and then advance up the hedge line. But you're still at a disadvantage on the other side. And the other thing that we saw in the first game was people actually used the smoke rules that we put in place, and
Yeah.
someone filled the runway with smoke and blocked. I think it was a
Brilliant.
Sig 33, completely
Brilliant.
blocked his line of sight on the first turn.
Brilliant.
Um,
I love that.
and so
Yeah.
yeah, so actually that really helped with the fact that actually the table probably wasn't the most playable table.
Well, it is playable, and you do have a lot of line of sight blocking, but that killing field in the center does it can be difficult to cross, right?
Indeed, yeah.
Then we had the V6, or what was it, launch ramp. I love this one. And there's like a fortress style something in the middle as well. This one for me was very open. But definitely playable. It was sort of what I would expect to see at any like major competitive event. There will always be a table like this, that is slightly open and does have some wonky terrain that maybe isn't made for bolt action, all of it, but it works, and especially with the forest on it, you can still hide. So for me, that this table was okay. How did you feel about this one?
Yeah, this was one that Paul brought.
Yeah,
And so huge thanks to Paul on that one. The
yeah,
piece in the middle was actually really nice up close, really well made, well painted. And actually that top bit lifts off, which is
yeah,
really nice. I think you're right with the open lines of sight. And
yeah,
actually, maybe if the forests, one or two of them had been more central rather than on the
yeah,
perimeter,
yeah.
it probably would have just got rid of enough of those lines of sight that you could attack
Or
from
at
more
least,
than one angle.
cut them up a bit more so that because on this table, if I was playing a gunline army, I know exactly where I would be setting up.
Yeah, 100%.
So yeah,
But no, it was
uh,
a really nice looking table.
yeah. This one was also pretty good. I especially like this one because you often see people trying to have a river on their tables, and it often doesn't work. I think it does on this one, because you do have like things that you can cover behind on one side of the river, and you do have other things on the other side of the river that makes sense, and you have a lot of places to cross. I really like this one actually. So and I also like the roads, especially because in the center of one of the roads, there's like a little bit of blocking here, um, that sort of makes it sure that you can't just rush out if you're playing envelopment, for instance, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of the requirements for a
Yeah,
lot of players. So as soon as they put a road down, the first thing they do
yeah.
is destroy it. Um, whereas I
But
didn't
or at
want to.
least make people like take a
Yeah,
few
so that's what
points.
I do. Rather than fully blocking the road, what I try to do is put down just a couple of things that make you have to sort of slalom around, which means you're not going to do it in 2 turns. And on the river, this is the way I like to play rivers, where you
Yeah,
have a tank. If you're doing it the short way, you have a
yeah,
tank bridge either end and an infantry
yeah,
bridge in the middle, so that it's sort of fair.
yeah. And here we have a rather nice looking winter table. Pity that some of the houses weren't painted, but some of them were. They look really nice, the ones in the bottom right corner here. Um, I quite like winter landscapes. I think maybe some of the forest there's a little bit too much forest on one side and not enough on the other side, for balance sake. But it does work, and there's a lot of line of sight blocking. You can really play a nice game on this table, I think. So this for me was one of the most the best competitive and the best setup tables. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's true. I've played on that, I think, near identical setup on that
yeah,
exact table. And
yeah,
yeah, it's a good table where you've got enough lines of sight that you can try something, but not so many
yeah,
that you can do whatever you want.
yeah. And again, we have this city table. City tables can be quite punishing if you're running multi-rocket launchers, but you were not. So how did that turn out? What was the playing on a city table like? What do you think that the players felt?
I think you're absolutely right. It was helped by the fact that we didn't have rocket launchers.
Yeah,
I think it was probably still a little bit dense.
yeah,
Just because from the previous one where we had so much line of sight, Here
Yeah.
you've got very limited line of sight
Yeah.
and very specific lines of sight as well.
Yeah, they're quite easily blocked here. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the road network's quite nice because you could actually, again, like that other one, you could drive all the way across the table on the
Yeah.
road, but you had to sort of go the long way around.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think if multi-launchers were back in, you'd definitely strip quite a lot of those houses off and
Oh
replace
yeah.
them with sort
Yeah.
of low walls or ruins.
Yeah. And desert tables. Oh, desert tables. I own 2 sets of desert tables myself, for my Eighth Army Brits, and they're really difficult to populate. They quite often turn out to be quite empty, or they sort of become an urban environment in North Africa for me, and this is sort of that as well. I do think this has enough for a desert table, but it can be quite open sometimes, right?
Yeah, indeed. I think speaking with, because I think Andy and I talked about this one on the day, and our thoughts on it were perhaps maybe like the other one, moving one of the patches of trees to the middle might
Yeah,
have been a bit helpful, or maybe some low walls here and there.
yeah,
Because playing on it, and I did see players doing this at a couple of games I was watching. They basically, it was like leapfrog, where you start
yeah.
behind one house and then you leapfrog behind the next house.
And
If
then
you're
yeah,
playing defensively, that's basically what you had to do.
yeah, it is. And that was the winter table again. And then we had another desert table here. Um, this one had quite some interesting hills on it, where the owner had cut up the hills so that you could sort of modularly set them together. I really like that idea. Um, and again, we have this problem of you have to have a lot of buildings in order to make a desert table really work. But I think the look of those hills really inspired me to maybe make some more hills for my desert table. I think that may be a good idea.
Yeah, they're
Um,
all 3D printed.
yeah,
So this is actually one of my tables, and they're all 3D printed.
yeah,
Because I really like the first time I used that, I played against a French cavalry army on it, and they
yeah.
did a cavalry charge over the hill down the flank, which was just
Lovely,
incredibly
lovely.
thematic.
Yeah,
And so, but as you say, it always is really difficult trying to find
yeah,
something to put on there that
yeah,
fits the theme, and that's why I printed a lot of those sort of standalone hills as well, so players
yeah,
could either play them as though they were walls or as dense terrain. And I set that one up with the idea that you could either choose the right hand side of the table and have the houses, or you could
yeah,
choose the left hand side and have more dense terrain.
yeah,
So if you got pick, it was sort of which one do you want?
yeah. Which one did people pick? Do you know?
Well, we played. There was the Japanese army faced off against the Polish cavalry on there, and I thought it was sort of random table draws in the second game on that one. And when I realized it happened, I thought actually this who picks sides going to be really important here,
It
because
is
if I'm
really,
facing the
really important.
cavalry, I'm choosing that side with the houses, and I'm going
Definitely.
to bed.
Yes. Into the houses and just shooting out every single window and opening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's
Okay.
what happened as well.
Ah, well, that makes sense because Russell, the player who played the Japanese, he actually finished quite well, whereas Simon, he got kicked down, I think, in the final standing. Okay, so I guess Russell won that game.
He did indeed,
Right,
yeah.
right. Okay, so that was the tables. I really enjoyed the tables. They were very, very good. There is a thing where when we view tables from different metas, that how much terrain you put on tables is also a meta thing. So, for instance, us going to the WTC and we viewed the tables over there, we were horrified. They were so bare. We are used to a lot of terrain on tables, and I think at one point I should send you some photos of some of the tables that we have. Sometimes they are they are they're really cluttered. You can easily have tables where there's no line of sight across them at all. So the tables are also a part of the meta. Um,
Definitely. I see a lot of the American tables seem to be quite bare. They tend to be obviously America's massive, so you're going to have sub metas within
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But a lot of the ones I see shared from America tend to be quite bare.
yeah,
And then, yeah, but I think the WTC tables, which I didn't attend, but I saw the pictures,
Yeah,
they weren't
also
British
very
meta either. I don't think they were any of the European metas. I think they
no
were
no
their own thing.
they were
Um,
sub they
yeah,
needed more terrain and especially
yeah.
more forests.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
think that was an easy fix as well. That was the my takeaway
yeah,
when I was looking at that. Actually, if someone had just went out and bought a load of trees and just popped them down, it probably
yeah.
would have fixed 90% of the problems with them.
It would. It would. And I think they're going to do that. But again, for us making tournaments as well, it's something to keep in mind as well, right? That we need a big box of trees, just pop them down somewhere, make forests. That always helps with playability, right? So that was the tables. Let's talk about the armies. I think you had a good variety of different armies, but I also think you had quite a huge spread of how competitive and non-competitive players were. Um, I've sort of started doing rankings for army lists, which are completely subjective and just my interpretation of how I view stuff and how powerful I think it is. Right. So a ranking from a one being barely usable to a five being hyper cheese, very win at all costs competitive, and you guys had lists that I would rank from a 1.5 to a 4.5. So that is a fairly large spread of how competitive or non-competitive the lists were. Um, I was sorry to see that there weren't many minor nations, which again could have given a better spread. Um, what would your takeaway from the nations that were chosen here?
Yeah, I was also disappointed not to see more minor nations. And I think, and that was part of the reason I said earlier, I gave the opportunity for those MMG trucks so that
Yeah,
the minor nations could have just a little perk to bring them in line with the major nations. And so I was a little bit disappointed by that, but equally, there are quite a few new players there. And
yeah,
so generally your new players pick one of the big
they
nations
do.
first, don't they? And so I think
Typically, they buy a German army.
yeah, that's exactly where I started, to be fair. So,
Most of us did.
yeah.
Most of us did.
Um, and so I think that was some of the reason for that was because of that. And then
Yeah,
I think the other part of the reason was because some people, although it was a friendly event, some people, it is still a tournament. They're
yeah,
still scoring, they're still first place. And so I think people still decide to take some of the tougher selectors.
yeah,
And I think once a selector gets a reputation, it becomes more popular, and that's what we saw with CeeLo Heights.
yeah.
I think we had 4 CeeLo lists, um,
Yes,
and it was a bit disappointing in a way from my perspective, just because I find it more exciting when you've got more nations. But it did mean it was quite interesting in terms of the result. Because the CeeLo Heights list is famously quite a tough one,
it is.
especially because you can have the famously popular tank, the M3 Stuart. Everyone
Yeah,
loves it,
yeah.
calls it out. And actually, one of the lists that took 2 Stuarts didn't finish very well, sort of bottom 3 ranking.
Yes,
And I think that highlighted for me that actually, really, the player is the important factor
yeah.
when it comes to the armies.
It is, and Russell and I did the numbers crunching after the WTC. He did all the numbers. I just helped him, um, and what we figured out was that if you're going to place a bet, then placing a bet on the list will get you the right result 50% of the time ish. If you place a bet on the player, it's 86% of the time. So the better player is what wins the match. It's not the list. Yes, good players will take hard lists, but if you're going to place bets, do it on the player, not the list. Definitely. And I must say, I was surprised by some of where some of the lists ended up as well. So in this one, so having sitting here and not seen who was the players, as soon as I saw the players, I knew who would be in the top three, um, ish, more or less. But before that, I was it it wasn't completely like I thought. The lists didn't pan out exactly like I thought they would. So in that respect, it is the player that makes a good list work. So what did you think? The top players here, did you feel like they were the best players as well?
Yeah, I think going in, we had two of the WTC players,
Yeah.
two Welsh team players, the ones with the English accents.
Yes.
They were coming along, and so I knew that they were going to do well.
Yeah.
And so Russell, who came along, brought his Japanese. He deliberately brought things that weren't ultra competitive because he knew it
Yep.
was a softer event.
Yep.
And he used it as an opportunity to try things out. So actually, he was trying out the native irregulars because he hasn't played them since the FAQ, give them
Mm.
a little bit of a points lift, I think. And so he actually said to me before the tournament that I just want to try these out because I know it's going to be a softer tournament. It'll give me a chance to play a bit more friendly and see how it goes.
Yeah. And Russell actually wrote to me, and he was like, the Japanese player, and he had mistyped or something, and I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know what he was thinking about that Japanese player. He wasn't trying to be competitive. I am the Japanese player. Oh.
Yeah,
um, and
yeah,
and he explained to me exactly that he didn't want to build an overpowered list, but still it is quite a good list, what he brought. And the native irregulars, they can do really well, even though they have been nerfed.
yeah. And importantly, I don't know how many years he's been playing Japanese, but it's a number of years, and
he
so he
he
knows those
knows.
units in and
Yeah.
out. And
Yeah.
that's the
Yep.
key thing, I think,
Yep.
because if you gave me that army, I would lose 9 times out of 10, I think. I might win the 10th game once I actually worked out what everything was supposed to be doing on the table.
Japanese are surprisingly difficult to actually win with. Um, it takes practice. Most of the top armies, I mean, you can go on the internet and find a list, and people will tell you this is really good and just play this and you'll win more games. Ah, it takes practice. It takes a lot of practice. The Japanese, especially, because their anti-tank is quite frankly crap. The suicide anti-tank guys are really difficult to make work. Yes, they hit really hard, but they're really difficult to actually contact the tank with. So there's a lot of work it takes to make that work, and the same thing with the fanatic and the Banzai. Yeah, they can be really powerful, but they don't. Just running ahead into the enemy machine guns, I mean, that will get your guys killed. So yeah,
Yeah, and I think that also raises a good point that I think is often overlooked, that how well your opponent knows your army often is
definitely.
a huge
Oh
factor,
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah,
if Russell was playing against his own Japanese, he
yeah,
knows exactly how to misdirect those
yeah.
banzais and
Yes,
cause mayhem for you if you're
yeah,
trying to get your inexperience to the table. So
yeah,
I think that's also a point that's often overlooked.
yeah. We also, if we're looking at the top, I mean, let's do the top six. We have three Russian armies. We have the Japanese. We have one British, and we have the Finns. I was surprised to not see any American armies in the top. Um, you didn't have that many American. Did you even have, like, you had one or
We
something like
had two American armies. We
two
had
American armies? Yeah, yeah,
um, Phil brought the Battle of the Bulge,
yeah,
which very much limited him in a way, because I think
yeah.
that selector is that the selector where you have to put your vehicles in reserve.
I can't remember, or everything had. That was the army where everything was veteran, right?
It
He
was
had bought everything veteran. Yeah,
And so basically his anti-tank was two bazookas,
yeah,
which when you face an armies with two tanks, I think that made his life a little bit difficult, because once you lose one of those
yeah.
bazookas, you're in
You're
trouble.
in
Once you've
trouble.
lost both, you're
Oh,
basically
you're
powerless.
done. You're done. Yeah,
And then Paul brought the Bloody Gulch list, which looked like a good list. It had two Shermans in it, which
mm,
was probably quite good in this sort of tournament setting.
yeah,
But I think I'm not sure if he was new with the list, but he didn't. I think it was more sort of finding his feet with the army that
yeah,
held him back rather than
yeah,
the list itself.
yeah. Okay. Um, my main surprise was the one Finnish army that finished sixth, which was quite well done. That was, I mean, because the rest, the Soviets, they were pretty much expected. I had sort of given them all either a 3.5 or a 4 in power levels. So all of that was really expected. The Finnish, they did well. Sean's Finns finishing number 6. But you can get really good results with Finns sometimes if you know the army and if you play well, you can really do well.
Yeah, I think that was actually quite a good list. I think it was one of those lists actually really nicely sort of balanced. It didn't have,
Yeah,
it had quite a lot of tractors,
yeah,
but other than that, it was fairly mixed bag. And I think, yeah, someone who really played a lot with that list
mm,
would probably have done really, really well with it.
yeah,
Sean's been playing it for a few months now, I think,
yeah,
and so he's sort of finding his feet with it,
yeah.
and he's tried different variations. But yeah, so I think
But
that
all those
one,
unreliable consonants, they are difficult to play, and finishing a number 6, that was that well done. I'll just say that.
yeah. Well, I
Uh,
actually think those the Comsomelettes are actually one of my favorite units in the entire game. When
okay.
I've got to finish army, and I
Yeah,
run 5 of them
yeah.
because you pay 42 points to have a
Yeah.
veteran machine gun, and it
It,
can't be wounded by
pretty
rifles
cheap.
except on a
Pretty cheap.
6.
Yeah, yeah.
And so actually, I run 5 of them,
Mm,
and sometimes they're used for transport if I'm playing a movement game, but
yeah.
otherwise, I just
They're
have a
just sitting
wall
on
of
your bag line,
light machine
machine gunning.
guns.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's 5 pins a turn and 5
Oh, I
order
would
dice. That means you might get
never
to go
do that.
first.
I would
Yeah.
never do that because for me, Finns are all about the veteran infantry. But I can see the point. But those unreliable special rules, they bug me. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not so bad with if you take them vet, you
Mm,
still test on an 8 after the
yeah.
first pin with the unreliable. And so you're testing the same as you would be for a regular. And I mean, it's basically a Bren carrier, but instead
Yeah.
of paying 60 points, you're paying 35 or 42. So
Yeah.
in my mind, it's an absolute bargain.
Right. Before we move on to the bottom, we're going to have to address the elephant in the room, which is Paul's British Army of Gurkhas and stewards and all the nastiness in the world in a tank platoon.
Yeah.
When I saw that one, I was immediately I went straight to a 4.5, almost the cheesiest, evilest army list you can have. And I should know this because I play that more or less the exact same list myself.
Yeah.
um,
Well, I
so
think
that was wicked.
it was a little bit, I mean, from my perspective, because we set the restrictions,
Yeah,
we allowed the tank platoons because I thought, let's see if someone wants to bring something really thematic.
yeah,
We didn't see that. But what I did see when I looked at it, it wasn't as optimized as I thought it
yeah,
could have been.
yeah,
I mean, he spent of the 1,050 points, he's got 35 points in an officer that I made him buy as a tax.
yeah, yeah.
And then there's 100 points tied up in vehicles, which actually the list isn't really going to use because it doesn't have a flamethrower that it needs to rush up.
Yeah.
The Gurkhas really don't want to be caught in a transport when it gets shot at. And so actually I thought this list was playing at a bit of a disadvantage. Um, in that regard, the big problem with it was, in my opinion, wasn't the fact that what it included. Um, it was who was wielding it
Oh yeah,
was the big problem because I know that Paul is a good player. He's
yeah,
played this list before,
yeah.
and so or a variant of it, and so I knew that it was going to do well. But by the same token, I think he would have done well with any of his armies that he usually brings.
Of course, yeah, no doubt. And he was the only one bringing a tank list. And I maybe fell into the trap of immediately saying to myself, "Well, this list is going to win," because there is this feeling that tank lists compared to regular generic reinforced platoons, or maybe even most theater platoons, are a bit overpowered. Um, and you guys didn't really see that Paul is a really good player, and his list was very, very strong. Yes, and he finished top, but he didn't win, right? So
Yeah, and I think I don't know if we want to spoil the results, but I actually think that his list may be the reason that he didn't come first.
yeah,
I think that might have caught him out because one of the things we did was because we were allowing platoons, the tanks couldn't hold or contest objectives,
mm,
which meant that actually if you're taking because we were single selector as well, it meant really if you take a tank platoon, you're limited to 3 infantry sections,
yeah,
and then a few small teams maybe.
mm,
And that was one of the things Russell said to me that if he'd played Paul on an objectives mission, he would have totally ignored those Stuarts that everyone's so
yeah,
scared of. He just would have shot the Gurkhas for a couple of turns and then wrapped the game up essentially.
yeah.
And I think
Because
that's absolutely spot
Paul
on.
couldn't then take any objectives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Right. Let's look at the bottom. We did see quite a lot of the German armies not make it to the top 8. So nation-wise, that was maybe what I had expected, that the German armies would end up in the bottom. So what did you see that you expected to happen?
Yeah, I think the Germans did about how you'd expect based on other
Yeah,
tournament performance. They ended, so the top German army ended about 8th, I believe, and then we went down to 11th and 12th. So
yeah,
there was 3 German armies there. But I don't think that tells the full story because you've got specific armies there. So I think P2 brought the 12th SS.
mm,
He, up until about a month before the tournament, I think he was planning to bring one of the mortar platoons from the D-Day book, and then changed his mind at the last minute because I think he just found it a bit finicky to remember who was shooting at who
yeah,
when he's doing his indirect. And so again, I think regardless of power level, I don't think he'd really tied down exactly how he was using that army yet. Um, and the Germans, yeah, I mean, it was for this event, that was actually quite a good list because every single squad, apart from one, had Panzerfaust. And so if you can't have flamethrowers, that's a really safe way to keep the tanks away.
yeah. It is. It is.
Um,
And I think if we're looking at the Germans, I also think that the James did quite well with his. He had a Puma and a Panzer IV, which I didn't like. I thought it was not competitive, and he still finished 8th. So he did quite well as well. So
yeah, I think
there were surprises. Yeah,
yeah, I think if unless I'm misremembering here and I'm confusing him with somebody else, I
mm.
believe James is a very new player, which is
Okay.
why which also explains his list composition because it's got all
Yeah,
the cool things in, doesn't it? It's got a
it
Panzer
does.
IV,
Yeah,
Puma, um, and
yeah.
so actually I think in terms of a tournament, he did really well with that army
Really, really well. Yeah,
and um, and actually the Puma and the Panzer having them together was actually really nice deterrent when people are bringing more tanks because
yeah.
they haven't got the risk of flamethrowers.
No. And the heavier armor can be beneficial when you're facing a lot of Stuarts. So yeah,
Yeah, I thought that would have been. I believe James played Paul with the Stuarts in the
yeah,
first game, and I thought that was going to be a really tough game for Paul because
mm,
just if the dice go James's way and he gets 1 or 2 good hits on a Stuart, once that tank platoon goes down to 2 or less tanks, it's
yeah,
suddenly not very scary. Um, and then
mm,
the last one was Sam's list with the
yeah,
Omaha Beach Resistance Net, which
yeah,
was entirely veteran.
yeah.
I I believe you'd actually reviewed a version of this list
I did.
before the event,
Yeah, yeah,
and that's very much how he likes to play.
yeah,
He's fully aware that his choices aren't necessarily optimum,
yeah.
but he really enjoys having fully veteran forces like his medium mortar because I think on at least I think it was 2 occasions at the tournament they actually fought off a close quarters assault, and that's what and so in his mind, he loves
It
having
will
them because
happen. It will happen. I always tell a story where I have lost a Gurkha unit in close combat to a medium mortar team that was regulars. They beat me in close combat. what can you do? That will happen. So yeah, I mean, having those veterans, and there is a thing when there's something that you do enjoy playing. I think you should do it because you will become better with that. So the choice might not be optimized. It just doesn't matter that much if that is what you enjoy and that fits your play style. It's worth more than actually optimizing in my eyes. So
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think he was a little bit that particular army, because it also took a veteran 88 at 200
yeah,
points.
yeah,
I think he got a little bit unlucky with the missions that were played
okay,
and the tables it was on, because it two of the missions were first wave that we chose, and yeah, and then he also, it's one of those ones where if you don't get your 88 set up in the right spot,
mm,
you're then playing around it rather than with it. But yeah, but I think it did do a really good job. I think he faced the double Sherman list,
yeah.
and the Shermans just hid the entire game and didn't do very much.
Brilliant. There was one list that I was surprised to see at the bottom, and that was Jack's CeeLo Heights list. He had body armor on his, and he had scouts and all of that, and he actually ended up in very near the bottom, which was quite a surprise to me. Anyway, um, so I don't know Jack at all, so I don't know how new or experienced he is, but just viewing his list, I had thought that he would have a better result. So yeah,
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it does show you just how important the player is in charge
yeah,
of the list, because that one was an incredibly strong list on paper. It had the
was
two Recce Stewarts, it had two mortars, it had a Ziz 3,
yeah,
and I think actually the bodyguard, sorry, the body armored engineers, they're a tough unit to
really tough.
play
Yeah,
without experience of them.
yeah,
It's one of the units that I would really avoid personally, because I'm spending a lot of points and then I really have to learn how to use them, because if I use
yeah.
them wrong, I don't get
They're
the
not
chance
going to
to
be
redeploy
good.
them.
Yeah, yeah. They're pretty much a one deployment unit. So you set them down, and then they're there. That is where they're not going to move, right? So yeah,
Exactly.
right. Anything we need to talk about with the bottom from here on,
Let's
or
have a
have we
quick look.
covered most of it? I think.
I think we covered that. Yeah, I think the other one that's always a popular list is Simon did bring the Polish Lancers, which
Yeah,
is again one of those army lists that you see a lot about online. And he came, I think it was 12th overall
yeah,
out of the 16.
yeah.
And again, I think that was just, he's quite new to that army, especially
Play
when.
Playing cavalry is really difficult. You need to train a lot, but you can do really, really well. It was basically the only minor nation at the WTC where we had 3 Polish armies at the WTC, and they all did very well. But they were players who were very experienced and who had trained quite a lot with that army, because playing cavalry is not easy. Yes, they hit like a ton of bricks, but oh my God, they are also quite vulnerable. So yeah,
Yeah, I think that's true. A lot of these sort of lists that become very popular online, people complain about specific units. A
yeah,
lot of them actually are quite difficult to play, a bit like we said with the
yeah,
Japanese earlier,
yeah,
because although it is really strong in one regard, it has very specific limitations in other
yeah,
ways, and so you
yes,
have to almost play around them,
yeah, you do.
and find a. And if it's not your play style, I think it might never work for you, because
Yeah.
I don't think I could play Polish Lancers really successfully overall.
I hope I can, because I really want to do an all cavalry army at one point. I'm not sure it's going to be Poles, but an all cavalry army, it just seems like so much fun. They're so maneuverable. So, right. The one thing I wanted to note here is now we've talked about the top and the bottom, and we've talked about sort of what lists ended up there. Um, the order dice. For me, this was very telling that the order dice meta, if you want to win a tournament, you need an order dice meta where your list ends up around 15 to 16. And I think the 16 was because you gave them those extra 50 points to play with. I really think that 15 at 1,000 points, 16 if you're 1,050, that is the order dice count that you need, because all of the top lists had 15 or 16 order dice. Very, very telling. And the rest, all of the low order dice count, they finished down at the bottom. So really, that order dice control is really crucial to winning games. So if there's one thing that I'll say that this tournament teaches newer players is you need to aim for 13 and above when you're building a list. You really do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think the rule of thumb that I've seen bandied around a lot is
Yeah.
one order dice for every 100 points as a minimum. And I think that's absolutely true. I think one order dice per 100 points, and then any high you can get past that without sacrificing on the quality of your units,
Yes.
will definitely do you an advantage, especially if you're facing something like the Polish Lancers. Getting first dice out the bag when they get close is hugely important, because they might be within surprise charge range. So if you can get that squad on ambush, then that's going to make all the difference.
It is. Between you just getting completely wiped, or at least taking a few guys with you when they
Yeah,
start.
because well, it's a bit like I think you've talked about sort of how many charges are in a unit, and even if that squad that ambushed them gets wiped straight away, if it took out 3 or 4 on the way in and 1 in
Then
combat,
they're not going to charge you again.
nope, they're now just running
Yep.
around trying to conserve the dice a lot of the time.
Yep. That is really, and when you're playing assault armies, then the calculation of how many assault you have is really important. Yeah. So, what meta did we see from this? I saw again the Stuarts. Of course, they're there. I also saw the expected top nations. I saw the Soviets. Like came out really strongly from this tournament. And that was expected. The Japanese did very well in the hands of a very experienced player, but I think that is needed for them to do well. I would have liked to see another Japanese list do poorly in the hands of another player, maybe. The Brits as well did very well, but again, very specific builds with the Brits, and again, players who knows what they're doing with them in order for them to do well. So I think the two main meta takeaways is that even though when you do make restrictions, you'll still see some of the same nations that we expect to do well in other tournament formats. They're still the same nations, and you still see the same order dice count, and you still see some of the same units as well. But of course, since you took out all the engineers and flamethrowers, none of that was there. So
Yeah, I think
so the what was actually in the list, there was a lot more SMGs than I was used to, which was kind of nice actually to see that. What did you see?
Yeah, I think the number of tanks was something that players commented on beforehand. I had a couple of conversations with people saying, why do we have so many tanks suddenly? Because there were a lot of 2-tank lists. So we had a list with 2 T-34s, 2 Shermans. We obviously had that one we were just talking about with the Panzer IV and the Puma. And I think that was sort of a number of factors where you had people, because they knew there weren't going to be any flamethrowers there, they knew that actually the tank might be a bit safer. And also because there's no flamethrowers there, they knew they needed anti-tank. And so those two factors, I think, led to a lot more tanks than you'd usually see.
And a lot more medium tanks
Yes.
than you'd usually see.
Yes, because you'd very rarely see 1 Sherman, never mind 2. Usually the Sherman you see as well as the howitzer version, but we got to see, I think the one with the double Sherman was actually just the medium anti-tank gun on it, which is really nice. I think the Stuart was ever present as always, because I think a bit like the Puma was in version 1, it's currently that unit that everyone tells everyone to include if they want to play competitively. I think it is good. I don't think, and this is controversial, I don't think it's as good as people say it is, because I personally would rather have 3 Recce Jeeps, because it's around the same price point.
Yes.
And
Interesting.
yeah, you get for your similar price, you get 3 machine guns, but the
Yeah.
benefit is they can put out 3 pins,
Yeah.
and you get 2 extra order dice. And
Yeah.
so that's why, in my mind, if you can find a selector that allows you to have 3 Recce Jeeps, I would always take that over 1 Recce Stewart every day of the
Okay.
week. But
Interesting.
there is no denying it
I
is
am.
good.
Oh, that really depends on which type of Jeep you're talking about when you're talking about the Recce Jeeps. Because if we're using the airborne Recce Jeeps for the Brits, oh, then maybe because they have double machine guns at the front. Oh, that is good, right? Otherwise, I'm not sure. I I think I don't think that the Darker Steward is less good than people say it is. I think it's extremely good, but I don't think that it is an auto include. I don't think you have to have one in order to win. Um, like we talked about earlier, it's the player, not necessarily the list, that wins games. So I don't think you have to have a steward to win.
Yeah, I
But
think that's probably
I do think it is a very good choice to do.
I think that's a really good way to put it, that
Yeah,
it's not an auto include.
yeah,
Because as I say, 140 points for 1 Recce Stewart, or I could
yeah,
pay 120
yeah,
for the 3 Jeeps. And I'd rather, personally, it very much fits my play style equally. So
yeah,
it's not entirely objective opinion, but
yeah.
I'd rather have the 3 Jeeps. But yeah, so that was somewhat the amount of CeeLo and Stewarts. I was hoping we'd see less of the same thing
Mm,
repeatedly, with it opening to all theatre selectors. I was really
no,
hoping we'd see some of the weird and wackies, but it didn't quite pan out like that.
no, no. Were there any units that you had expected to be there that weren't there? Like any units that were never taken or that you should never
Ooh.
take?
That's a really interesting question. I can't think of anything that I definitely would have put in that I didn't see, um, because we'd shifted the meta so much with the bizarre restrictions. I think there was nothing that sprung to mind for me.
Hmm.
I'm a big fan of a heavy mortar, especially in this sort of
Yeah.
format where if I haven't got flamethrowers, having something that will do a lot of damage to a tank, at least a lot of pins, I would have expected slightly more heavy mortars over medium mortars.
Okay.
Um, but actually, on the reverse of that, I think the thing that we saw a lot of that I wasn't expecting was light machine guns. There were a lot of light machine guns.
Yeah, there were. There were. And if you notice, most of the lists that were in the top did not have light machine guns in them.
Yeah, I think
They're,
that's
they're not worth the points, guys. Sorry.
I
Um,
really don't think they are. I think you're absolutely right.
no.
They're not. I think one of the things we do sometimes overlook is there is a play style with light machine guns that I've seen used effectively, where instead of using them as a backline holder, you use them as a fire maneuver. So
Yeah.
you advance with them because you're only at -1 to hit. If you've
Mm,
got German squad with 2 in there, you're putting out a lot of shots over a wall. And so I've seen players use that quite effectively. But the problem always will be with that is no matter how effective it is, you've paid too many points for it.
yes, you have.
Um,
Yeah, you have. Um, so for me, there were a few takeaways, and one of them I'm undecided on, and one of them I definitely am decided on. Um, the the heavy tanks, the KV2 and maybe even the Panzer IV, are not worth their points. They are too expensive, and I think this result shows that as well. However, the medium tanks, I'm still on the fence about those. I still need to see a good player utilize a medium tank effectively, maybe as a counter to all those damn stewards everywhere, and see how that turns out. And I don't think this result shows this clearly yet, that medium tanks are not worth it. So let's see what happens in the future with that. But definitely the heavy tanks, when you just have one heavy tank like the KB2, for instance, it becomes so easy to pin, and then it's not worth anything. So it's not even earning back the huge amount of points you poured into it. Um, So you if you want to win games, you should stay away from the heavy tanks. They're quite fun to paint up, and they're quite lovely models, some of them, but they won't win you many games. They won't. So that was my never take. Right. Now, did I expect these results? When you sent me the list, you had sort of cut out the names, so I couldn't see who was who. But in the top, there was one of my, as I said, I ranked all the lists from 1 to 5, 5 being the most competitive, and in the top 5, there was one list that was a 3.5er. The rest of them were 4s or above. And in the rest, the bottom, below the top 5, there was one list that was a 4. So at least for me, I sort of feel like I can sort of predict who's going to win tournaments based on their lists. Maybe it's just because the most competitive players also built the most competitive lists. I guess that's part of the reason.
Yeah,
So
that's what I don't know if I said that earlier, but I was definitely
yeah,
thinking it when you were talking about list building and being able to predict based on the
yeah,
list. The
yeah,
fact that actually, if you look at a list and
yeah,
it doesn't have any of the softer units that people would say waste points like a machine gun,
mm,
then it tells you that the player has considered the list quite a lot.
yeah,
And that maybe they probably thought about how they're going to use it.
yeah. However, the bottom was way more spread out than I imagined. It was more difficult to actually imagine or predict where these guys were going to end. So some of the lists that I didn't like and criticized quite a lot, they ended up doing a lot better than I thought they would. So at least below the top 5, it becomes more difficult to predict based on lists, I think. So, which is kind of nice actually, because that means that even though you're not bringing your optimized super whacker list, you're just bringing something that you think is thematic or something that you like. You can still do fairly well. You might not be able to win the tournament, but you can do well. You can win games with it. At an event, and I quite like that result actually.
Yeah, and I think that will always, when it's a one-day event with 3 games, I think that'll often happen because you might have a bad first game, get knocked right down, but
Mm,
then of course you're playing someone else who had a bad first game, and so you might then bounce all the way back up,
yeah,
and then you in your final game you're
yeah,
placing someone else mid-table, and
yeah,
then because we didn't do our scoring was slightly different to a lot of tournaments where actually you got 9 points for a major victory, 8 points for a minor victory, 4 points for a draw, two for a minor loss, and then one for a major loss.
okay,
And what that meant was in those games where you're losing, it's still worth fighting on to try and get that. And again, you got 1 point for a secondary. And I think one day is, as I say, you bounce around, and then
mm,
with those additional ways to sort of have less points for a victory or maybe
yeah,
lose less points for a
yeah,
loss, the middle always will be a little bit more interesting, I think.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's really interesting because I often feel that when you go to tournaments and it's Swiss draw and it's based on win loss and you don't get any points for it. You just how many wins did you have? I had 3. Super, you're in the lead, and then kill points next, and that's it. But this system also should mean that it's fairly easy to match players up, right?
Yeah, it made it. It should, I think, over a 5-day event, it would give you a really nice spread of
Yeah,
players,
yeah,
um, which would by game 5, I think you would have a very good rather than having 4 players on 4, players on 2, players on
yeah,
1,
yeah,
you'd end up with a whole array of points by the end
yeah,
of the 4th game,
yeah.
which means that hopefully you'd really see that. I think over 3 days, the first round's random, and so you might get a really but you might get a draw that
Bad
really you're
matchup. Yeah, yeah,
suffering, yeah.
yeah.
Um, and so you don't see it. But by the end, we did end up with quite a nice spread.
Mm, that's good. Right. So that was the armies. Now, you've basically left us here with the impression that this was a perfect tournament and nothing bad happened. But in our notes, there is the controversy. Was there any like did you guys, the TOs, have to settle any disputes or rules? Because I mean, constantly there are people arguing rules when I go play. So
Yeah.
how did that turn out?
Well, I'll give quite a long answer to that. So in terms of how smooth the tournament was, we were planning. So this was actually the first tournament Andy and I had ran together there, and so it was a bit of a test to see how smoothly we could get things. And we had planned to go over the evening before, set up most of the tables, so we could really sort of ease into the day, make sure we had all the parents lined up and whatnot. But actually, at the last minute, we couldn't get into the shop the night before because
Oh,
there was a mix up with a booking for a D&D group, I think, and they were in late, and so we couldn't get in. And so what it meant was we got there at 8 o'clock in the morning, setting up for the players arriving at half 9, 10.
oh,
Um, and so it was a little bit hectic in the morning. But actually, what was really nice is we sent out a form after the event to get feedback, and it was really positive. It seems like people didn't notice just how sort of chaotic that setup felt to me. It felt like well, by the time most of the players arrived, I think most of the tables were set up. They thought it was they
yeah,
thought it was quite smooth sailing from there. And yeah, as I say, on the feedback form, the first question I just put, did you enjoy the tournament? And the feedback, I think it was 9.5 out of 10
mm,
on average sort of response to that. So I think generally people were very happy with it. In terms of TO decisions, what I decided to do was what I'd seen Paul Walker do, who runs
yeah,
sort of the nationals over here and also the WTC.
yeah,
He has a rule where he tells the players to look it up in the rule book, look it up in the FAQ. If that doesn't work, I'll come over and make a
yeah.
decision. I might
It
be
might be
wrong,
the wrong one. Yeah,
but it gets you moving. And I said that as we said, I said that to all the players beforehand because I very much wanted the players to talk to each other about it, especially with it being a friendlier one. I thought that was a really nice way to do it because if you're a new player, it's no good just find out what the answer is. You want to know where it is as well because it might come up next game. And so I think spending that time looking for the rule really helps those new
and your
players.
players had the time to do that because of the way you had set up the end of game system,
Yeah,
where they could finish their turn. So, I mean, when we were at the WTC, people were rushed, and I know that some people there felt like they didn't want to argue too long about rules because they wanted to finish the game as well. So,
yeah. And what was quite nice on that is um, the experienced players I overheard helping the less
yeah,
experienced players, and not necessarily just with rules queries. There was one point I heard Russell. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, but he said something like, "What I always do because I find it helpful is this," and I think it was one of those, the NCO killed markers.
yeah,
So I think he'd killed one of Simon's NCOs, and he
yeah,
said, "Look, I always do this. Would you like to borrow one so you don't forget?"
yeah,
Which obviously helps Russell because it means Simon doesn't forget. But also, I think Simon really liked it because it helped him to understand how to play more
yeah,
fluently.
yeah.
Um, so that was really good. The missions went well.
Mhm.
I don't know if we talked about the missions actually because we did a
We
little
didn't.
bit something
We
interesting
didn't.
there.
Yeah.
Um,
What missions did you play?
so we played two custom missions that
Yeah.
I'd written, and then we played one of the rulebook missions. So I went for the standard tournament arrangement of one objectives, one kill point, one
Yeah.
movement. Um,
Per-
yeah,
Perfect.
and
I always do that.
yeah, I think it's nice because each army will have a strength in one
Yeah.
area. I
Yeah.
think that nicely levels the playing field. And so we opened with one which I wrote as a replacement for Top Secret,
Okay.
where it's basically key positions, but what you do
Yeah.
at the beginning is you have so the objectives are playing card suits. You get four playing cards, so let's say the four aces.
Yeah.
You randomly get rid of one of them, so you're left with three, and then those are the three objectives that you're trying to get, and then you keep them secret for the entire game. Your
Okay.
opponent does the same thing. You play the whole game as those key key positions, you can contest all the objectives, but you only score victory points for the 3 in your hand. And then at the end, you get that sort of the
reveal
bluffing.
at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I really like it, because you play the whole game not knowing if you're winning or losing necessarily until the very end when you reveal those cards. And that one, yeah, all the players. So the question I asked on the feedback was it a good mission for tournament play? And all of them seemed to have quite liked that one. I really obviously I play tested that one before I threw it into a tournament, and I really enjoyed playing that because I really enjoy that sort of bluff and bluster when people say, no, I'm actually after the spades actually. And so yes, that was what we opened with. Then we went to, I find with meeting engagement, without a focus, it can sometimes turn to a gun line where I kill a dice early on and then I hide because I know I've won the game. And so we played, again, Manhunt is a mission that no one ever plays at tournaments or even in clubs very often because it's not a great mission in my opinion. Yeah.
Especially not if you have tank platoons there.
Yeah. So what we did was we played a version of that where essentially it's quite a lot like meeting engagement, but if you kill the enemy lieutenant, so it's the highest ranking officer. So if you take a major, I've got to kill your major instead. But if I kill your lieutenant, I get 5 victory points.
Ooh.
And so it just gives your army a little bit of focus. It's a bit like demolition where you think, do I go for the objective? And the feedback on that one was generally that most of the players liked it. I think there was sort of all but 2 gave good responses. And the 2 negative comments, I think, were that because it was only worth 5 victory points, the player thought that trying to kill the officer would cost him 5 order dice and it wasn't worth it. And so for him, his game just descended into traditional meeting engagement, which, to be fair, isn't a bad place to fall back to.
It's not bad at all. Okay.
Yeah, so I think in future we might up the bounty on the officer, make him 10 or something, just to really encourage people to chase
10
him.
points. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's the problem with it is it's very easy to hide the officer, and so you've really got to make it worthwhile, I think. So, and I thought 5 was enough victory points, but I think I might have to up the price just to tease people into chasing the officer.
6, maybe 7.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the last mission was just good old sectors. I chose that one just because I think double envelopment, as much as I like it, I think the slower armies don't like double envelopment very much.
Yeah, it really favors armies that have a lot of vehicles. Okay.
Oh yeah, actually, the original question was, were there any controversies? In terms of the TO, and there was, because as I said earlier, I told the players to look it up first. There was actually not a lot of rules questions that we had to answer as Andy and I went round. And one of the things we noticed actually was as you go around, the closer you are, the more questions you get. And I didn't really want to be deciding games for people. And so actually what we did was...
You stayed back?
Yeah, we tried to stay back as much as possible. But then it was a delicate... we found ourselves discussing it on the day. Should we go around more or should we go around less? Because we want to be there to overhear if people are starting to get into a rules query, just in case it gets a bit heated. But at the same time, we didn't want to stand on someone's shoulder and have them constantly asking questions. And so I did ask the players what they thought of the TOing. Sort of, was it about right? Did we walk around too much and too little? And generally, sort of 80% of the players thought we got it about right. And then the other ones thought both ways, I think. And so I think it was probably about right. And so the only real controversy we had was some of the players were a little bit unhappy with the tank platoon. And I think going forward, we probably won't have tank platoons.
I think if you're going to go friendly going forward, I think you should cut out the tank platoons. Maybe even think about not having theater platoons as well. Although they are quite fun, but there are some of them that are overpowered. We could see that with the Silo Heights. lists. They're just some of the theatre platoons where the rules are really fun and really interesting, and you want to have them. But then people bring the CeeLo heights, and then what do you do, right?
Yeah. And that
Anyway,
was, I did consider, do we just ban CeeLo heights? And then people, and that was one of the conversations we had, should we allow generic if we're aiming to have as much flavor as possible? And I thought actually having generic, you can build quite a strong army. And so you're not going to be underpowered. If people are bringing quite strong theatre selectors, you should be on par.
yeah. Right. So what's on the menu for next? What are you doing next time?
Yeah, so the next one is the English Open, which we've announced. Hopefully, all the people who are interested have already seen, but I imagine some people haven't seen it yet, so it's always worth mentioning. And that's going to be very much taking what we've learned from that one, building on that. We've also got Mike, who is reasonably well known in the English bolt action community because he ran Beachhead this year, which is quite a big tournament.
Yeah.
And Phil from one of the local clubs who plays with Pegasus as well. And so there's going to be 4 of us TOing the tournament, which should mean it's really smooth sailing. And so we're going to take all those things that we've learned. There are no tank platoons for the English Open, but we have kept.
Is it going to be generic only, or are you going to go theatres as well?
So we're very much building it in the style of, I don't know if you're aware of the Welsh Open and Mark Vance over in Wales running that one. And they're very much aiming at thematic, sort of soft competitive. And so we're doing that route. And so we are allowing theatre platoons. For any theatre platoon, generic is allowed, but we have dropped tank platoons. And what we've done is we've shifted the restrictions slightly. And so we are allowing 1 flamethrower. What I'm really hoping we see is people use that opportunity to take a flamethrowing tank, because actually I think they're probably less efficient but more fun, in my opinion.
Ooh, I wouldn't say that. I can name a few vehicles that are really efficient with a flamethrower. But anyways, okay.
So
I know
I'm
what
hoping,
I want to take.
so I'm hoping to see some of them. We've got 1 multi-launcher. These are the restrictions. As I say, we're very much the Welsh Open's really a successful event, so we're very much going down the avenues. And I think they usually do a 2 flamethrower, 1 multi-launcher limit. And one of the things we did, because we've opened it to all those theatre selectors, we are limiting Gurkhas and Lancers and Bamboo Spearmen. And that's just to stop, because the armies, I think that
you want a more variety in your army list.
More variety. And I think as well, with it being thematic, you're going to get a lot of players who are playing for sort of not so much to win. They're playing because they're playing with the models they really enjoy. And I think what often happens with these sort of very specific focused armies is you have to counter them in a very specific way. And if you're used to playing very sort of matched lists, you're not used to that counter. And so you're often caught off guard. So even if, let's say, the Polish cavalry aren't overpowered, they'd still catch you off guard if you're not used to them. Because actually, I think of the 3 there, the one that is probably the Gurkhas, the Bamboo Spearmen, and the cavalry. I think the Gurkhas are probably the one, in my opinion, that are a little bit cheesy, for want of a better word, because they're undercosted. Whereas the other ones, I think you're paying a fair price for them.
You're paying a fair price for bamboos and for the lances as well. The Gurkhas are a bit undercosted. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, and so as I say, it's going to be a really fun event. Hopefully, it's going to be bigger than the Open, because we are running it as part of the Selwig show, which is a really big show. They're running on the Sunday at the same venue and Lee Valley Athletic Centre, and it's part of the BHGS, the British Historical Games Society. It's part of their historical teams event, so we've got a lot more space, because there's about 6 systems I think playing there, and so it'll be a bigger tournament.
what I know I don't want to jinx this, but what range of players are you aiming for? How many do you think that you're going to get, or what would be the maximum that you think could be possible?
So we've opened up to 32 at the moment.
Okay.
There is potential to expand if it's really popular. 32 was a number we thought would be quite good because it means because there's 4 of us running it, that's sort of 8 players per person.
Yeah.
And it
Then you're
means,
pretty well TO'd. Yeah.
yeah, very well TO'd. Setup should be a breeze with so many TOs. And so that's sort of the number we're looking at the moment. As I say, it may be that if it's hugely popular, we can find some extra tickets, but that'll very much come down to players buying in.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
yeah,
That
brilliant.
was it, Johnny. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for having given me all this free content for my channel, basically. So it's been really nice talking to you, and I hope that the English Open will go well as well. And thank you so much to all the players who attended Aldershot and for letting me review your lists. Again, I'm sorry for the ones I didn't like. And for the cheesy kids, Paul and Russell, I'll see you next time and beat you next time. Right. That was it. Any final words, Johnny?
No, just you're very welcome for the free content. I think it's a fair price to pay for the hype you built for the tournament. So thank you in return.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Cheers.
Cheers.